Rain hammered the rusted tin roof of the Cold Creek post office. Inside, the air was thick with silence and the weight of 100 unspoken accusations. On the counter lay a weathered yellow envelope. The ink on its slanted handwriting faded, but still legible. To the people of Cold Creek, read only after I'm gone. Mabel Harris stood frozen. Her hands trembled, but the eyes of the townspeople felt like sharp needles pressing into her back. Someone whispered, "That's Whitaker's handwriting. But he's been dead for 3 months." Outside, thunder cracked, and wind slapped against the glass as if urging her to act. Mabel drew in a breath, her fingers finding the edge of the envelope. Just before she tore it open, memories surged, dragging her back to the day everything changed. The morning of the fire began, like any other autumn day, in Cold Creek. A thin veil of frost coated the fields, and the first fingers of sunlight stretched over the pines, turning their needles to gold. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from chimneys and the earthy temp soil. In this corner of Montana, mornings carried a sense of routine, as if nothing could ever truly disturb the rhythm of the town. Mabel Harris was standing in her kitchen, sleeves rolled up, rolling pie dough on the counter. Her husband, David, sat at the table, sipping black coffee, his eyes half focused on the local paper. Jonah, their 16-year-old son, was lacing up his sneakers by the door, muttering something about basketball practice after school. Everything was quiet, comfortable-ordinary. Then the sirens began. It was a sound that didn't belong in the stillness of Cold Creek, high-pitched, urgent, tearing through the morning calm. Mabel froze, her rolling pin hovering midair. David set down his coffee with a frown and moved to the window. From where they stood, they could see a thin column of smoke curling into the sky beyond the tree line toward the north side of town. "That's near the Whitaker place," David said, his voice edged with concern. Thomas Whitaker's grain barn was a landmark, an old, towering structure built from thick timber, holding the harvests of several surrounding farms. Its presence was as much a part of the town's identity as the white-steepled church. Within minutes, the single fire engine Cold Creek possessed roared past their house, followed by 2 volunteer trucks. Jonah stepped out onto the porch, eyes wide. "I'm going down there," David said, already grabbing his jacket. "They might need extra hands." Mabel's stomach tightened. Fires in this town didn't happen often, but when they did, everyone pitched in. She didn't like the way the smoke was thickening. "Be careful," she called after him, but her voice was swallowed by the crunch of gravel as he jogged down the lane. By the time Mabel reached the scene, half an hour later, the barn was a monster of flames. The wood popped and splintered under the heat, sending sparks shooting into the pale morning sky. The fire had a strange beauty, an awful, mesmerizing dance of orange and black. Heat pressed against her face even from the road. A crowd had gathered, neighbors, farmers, shopkeepers, everyone except those tending to their own fragile harvests. Some were shouting, others simply stared. The volunteer firemen scrambled, hoses hissing as they sprayed arcs of water into the inferno. But it was too late. The barn's skeletal frame was already groaning, threatening to collapse. Mabel spotted David among the volunteers, his shirt damp with sweat, face streaked with soot. He was helping haul sacks of grain out of a smaller shed nearby, trying to save what they could before the flames reached it. Through the chaos, Thomas Whitaker stood apart, his wide frame hunched, face pale beneath the brim of his hat. His lips were moving, but whether in prayer or cursing, Mabel couldn't tell. He looked dazed. The barn gave its final cry with a deep, resonant crack. Then the roof folded inward, sending a wave of heat and a shower of sparks toward the watching crowd. Gasps and shouts filled the air. A moment later, it was over the Whitaker's barn, and months of work reduced to a smoldering heap. In the aftermath, the town lingered. The firefighters wound up hoses, the smell of wet ash mixing with the acrid bite of burned grain. People spoke in hushed tones, and Mabel noticed how several heads turned toward David. At first, she thought it was simple acknowledgement he'd been helping, after all, but the glances lingered too long, carried too much weight. She brushed it off until she overheard Mrs. Latham, the grocer's wife, whispering to a man beside her. "Didn't David have words with Thomas just last week, over that equipment loan?" "Yeah, got pretty heated," I heard. Mabel's heart thudded. She wanted to step in, to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. David emerged from behind the shed, his expression tight, avoiding her eyes as he passed. That evening, the Harrises ate in near silence. Jonah poked at his mashed potatoes without appetite. Mabel finally asked, "What happened with Thomas last week?" David looked up sharply. "Nothing worth repeating. He accused me of returning the thresher late and in bad shape. I told him it was fine when I brought it back. That's all." "People are talking," Mabel said carefully. "They always talk," David muttered, pushing his plate away. "Let them." But in Cold Creek, talk wasn't harmless. It spread like the same wind that had fanned the barn's flames, fast, invisible, and impossible to contain. Over the next few days, the fire became the only topic of conversation. At the diner, whispers curled between cups of coffee. At the hardware store, Mabel caught someone cutting off a sentence when she walked in. Jonah came home from school saying a classmate had called his father an arsonist. The official word from the volunteer fire chief was inconclusive, possibly an accident, possibly negligence, but that didn't stop the theories. Some claimed they'd seen David near the barn late the night before the fire. Others suggested he'd had a grudge over the Whitakers' influence on town council decisions. Mabel knew none of it was true, but the certainty in people's voices was terrifying. One afternoon, Mabel went to the market for flour. Mrs. Latham's smile was thin, her greeting perfunctory. As Mabel turned to leave, she overheard another shopper murmur, "If you ask me, Harris should be in jail." That night, she told David what she'd heard. He only shook his head, jaw clenched. "I'm not going to beg them to believe me, but what if it doesn't blow over?" she pressed. His eyes were dark when he met hers. "Then I guess we find out what it's like to live in a place where your neighbors turn into strangers." The first snow of the season fell a week later, blanketing the blackened ruins of the Whitaker barn. The smell of smoke lingered long after the fire had died, as if refusing to let the town forget. For Mabel, that scent became a warning, a reminder that the fire had burned more than wood and grain. It had ignited something in Cold Creek's people, something harder to put out. And though she didn't yet know it, this was only the beginning of the long, cold season for the Harris family. The frost clung longer each morning after the fire, as if the whole town had frozen at the precise moment suspicion took root. By Christmas, the Harrises celebrated alone. Mabel set out the good plates anyway, lit 2 beeswax candles, and put on a scratched record of carols. Jonah pretended not to notice the empty chairs. David carved the ham in silence, the blade scraping porcelain every time he cut too close to the plate. They ate, they praised the food, they stacked the dishes. No one mentioned the 3 invitations that hadn't arrived this year: the church potluck, the Whitaker wreath-making afternoon, the mayor's cocoa on the square. The next morning, Mabel pulled on boots and trudged into town for flour and eggs. At Latham's grocery, the bell over the door rang with its usual cheer. Mrs. Latham, behind the register, kept her smile perfectly smooth and thin, like icing spread to hide a cracked cake. "Morning, Mabel," she said, the words tipped politely upward and set down carefully out of reach. "Morning," Mabel answered, picking a basket. 2 teenagers in puffy jackets stood by the apples, talking in the deliberate hush of people who want to be overheard. "My dad says once a firebug, always a firebug." "Not proven," the other replied, but his smirk said the same thing. As the first boy's certainty, Mabel selected eggs with meticulous care, one at a time, as if the steadiness of her hands could prove anything at all. She added flour, a stick of cinnamon, and 3 oranges, because even a cold house felt warmer when it smelled like citrusand. Set the basket on the counter. "That'll be $7.82, Mrs. Latham said. As Mabel reached for her wallet, a woman in a red scarf stepped to the front of the line with a pleading smile. "I'm so sorry, Can. I just grabbed cash back. I'm late for school pickup." "It's fine," Mabel said, moving half a step back. The woman did not look at her, only slid her card, laughed with Mrs. Latham about busy days, and left with a breeze of perfume and relief. When Mabel finally paid, her receipt came without the usual scribbled snowflake Mrs. Latham had drawn every December since forever. There was nothing on the pale strip but numbers and the time. On her way out, a toddler in a puffy coat waved at her. Mabel smiled and waved back. The child's mother tugged him closer by the sleeve, as if Mabel were a stray dog that might nip outside. The air bit at her cheeks. She tucked the receipt deep in her pocket, as if hiding it could keep it from meaning anything. On Sundays, the church doors swung wide and let out warm breath coffee, wool, the faint spice of cloves in the pastor's tea. The first Sunday after Christmas, the pews were full, coats piled like sleeping animals along the back. Mabel and Jonah took their usual spot halfway down on the left. David sat on the aisle, shoulders set in that stubborn way he had when bracing for a blow he refused to see. When they stood for the hymn, a space opened around them, small at first, barely a step, then to the choir lifted it came upon the midnight clear, and Mabel heard, threaded inside the melody, the shiver of people choosing to stand elsewhere. After the benediction, Pastor Mark descended from the pulpit with the slow gravity of a man walking down from a mountain. He shook hands in the aisle, booming out names. "Good to see you, Rick. How's your mother, Angie?" When he reached David, his hand paused midair. "David," he said. The name sounded like a verdict. He didn't ask about Jonah's grades or Mabel's pies. Didn't say they'd been missed. His grip was brief, his eyes skimming past like a stone tossed across a lake, touching, skipping, gone, in the fellowship hall. The punch bowl glowed pink under fluorescent lights. Cookie platters lined folding tables. Jonah waited his turn, reached for a sugar cookie, and found 3 hands reaching around him to snatch the good ones away. "Oops," a boy said with a grin, not moving an inch to make room. Mabel stood with a paper cup of weak coffee. The coffee smelled like church basement and old newsprint. Beside her, Judy Park leaned in and lowered her voice. "You must be exhausted, Mabel, with everything." "It's the holidays," Mabel said. "Everyone's tired." Judy's eyes were kind enough to sting. Let me know if you need anything. It wasn't the offer that hurt, it was the way Judy held her cup with both hands, like keeping them busy might save her from the temptation of touching Mabel's arm. At the high school gym, winter basketball practice thudded and squeaked across polished floors. Jonah laced his sneakers tight, took his spot for layup lines, and ran until his lungs burned. He had the kind of shot that made a Hush Falkline soft backspin like a promise. Coach swallowed a compliment every time Jonah sank a three. After practice, boys gathered in a ring near the lockers and fell quiet when he approached. You guys heading to Jock's for fries? Jonah asked. A boy with a shaved stripe in his eyebrow shrugged, theatrical. Oh man, we're full up. He gestured to open air. An empty seatbelt snapped across nothing. Jonah swallowed and nodded as if he'd expected it. Outside, he practiced again in the dark, his breath turning to steam, the net whispering its soft, perfect syllable when the ball caught center. When he came home with red knuckles and the smell of cold on his hoodie, Mabel handed him a mug of cocoa and kissed his hairline. You don't have to prove anything, she said. I know, Jonah answered. He stared into the mug like it might have a map at the bottom. I just don't know what else to do. Work thin the way ice thins, deceptively fast. David drove his battered pickup between job sites repairing fences, cutting storm-fallen branches, once building a shelf at the library for a $60 check he pretended not to count. In January, 3 calls he'd expected never came. In February, the hardware store stopped extending him credit. By March, he stood at the service desk, hat in hand, and listened to the assistant manager explain how the new policy required cash. Up front, I've been paying you 30 years, David said, and we appreciate that. The assistant manager said, eyes drifting toward anywhere else. It's just policy. On the way out, David's shoulder clipped a cardboard display, and a pyramid of nails avalanched as he knelt to gather the small silver darts. No one offered a hand. He left the last handful on the floor and walked out into a noon so bright, it felt like a dare dot at home. He stacked unpaid bills into careful towers. It'll pass, he told Mabel. By spring, people will have new gossip. Mabel folded a dish towel and refolded it. They don't need proof when they have a story. What story? David snapped, then bit off the heat in his voice. Ashamed. Sorry, he said, quieter. I'm sorry. I know this is hard on you. It's hard on us, she said. But even as she said it, she saw how the town's silence pressed harder on him than on anyone. Men in small places measure themselves against what other men think. Cold Creek had turned away, and the shape of David's days had been left lopsided. They learned to anticipate the small humiliations. The mail carrier began leaving their letters at the very back of the box, as if even envelopes could catch something. At the 4th of July picnic, a family unfolded their blanket, noticed the Harrises sitting nearby, and refolded it with cheerful efficiency 30 feet away. The mayor's wife, who had once asked Mabel for her secret pie crust trick, now asked her loudly if she had made any new friends online, as if she were a child being encouraged to try a new hobby. Sometimes people were cruel by pretending not to be, other times they were simply human, afraid of choosing the losing side, afraid of being the only one to say the emperor had no clothes. When the Whitakers rebuilt their barn with insurance money, Mabel brought by a tin of lemon squares and left it on the porch with a card. No one opened the door. The squares were gone by morning, and the card was in the trash beside the steps, rain-blurred and half stuck to a coffee filter. She told herself raccoons had dragged it there. In April, the high school hosted a fundraiser scrimmage. The gym smelled like popcorn and varnish. Banners clapped against the walls whenever someone opened a door. Jonah warmed up alone at the far hoop until the rest of the team arrived in a jostle of jokes and cologne. During the game, he moved like a metronome, precise, steady, unspectacular. At halftime, he sank a buzzer beater that should have brought the crowd to its feet. Instead, claps scattered like stray coins rolling under bleachers. Coach slapped the shoulder of another boy who'd missed 2 free throws but told a good joke. Afterward, a man in a Whitaker seed cap approached Jonah by the water fountain. Good game, the man said. You've got your mama's focus. Jonah blinked. The compliment was so sudden that for a second he forgot how to receive it. Thanks, he said. The man's eyes flicked toward the exit where Mabel waited. Small in her winter coat, he hesitated, then added, your dad. Well, folks say a lot of things. Not all of them mean anything. Jonah nodded. When the man walked away, he leaned his head against the cool tile and closed his eyes just long enough to feel the relief of not holding everything upright. Tension at home gathered in corners like dust. The house was clean, Mabel saw to that, but silence makes clutter of its own. Jonah clomped upstairs louder than he needed to. Mabel cooked too much and froze leftovers in neat, labeled containers. Stew, chili, chicken pot pie. David began to take long drives after dinner, returning with the smell of night fields in his jacket and the look of a man who had been practicing his exit. One evening, he sat down at the kitchen table with a stack of flyers. A guy out of Billings needs long-haul drivers, he said, not raising his eyes. Pays steady. It'd be away. How far away? Mabel asked. South Dakota routes. Sometimes farther, for how long at a time? A week, maybe 2, depends. Mabel folded and unfolded a napkin until it made hard little squares. So that's the plan. It's a plan, he said. He tried a smile that failed. I can't keep waiting for my phone to ring here. I know, she said. She reached across the table and touched his forearm. He turned his hand so their fingers could meet in the small space between bills and flyers. For a moment, they were the old version of themselves to people who believed the world could not be as narrow as a single town's rumor. From the stairs, Jonah listened without trying to, the words coming through the banister like water through pipes. He went to his room and closed the door very gently, as if loudness might make it true faster. The week before David left, Mabel baked 3 loaves of bread and wrapped them in butcher paper. She wrote for the road on one, for the red-eye miles on another, and come home safe on the last. She tucked a photograph of the 3 of them into the glove compartment of his truck, one from a summer at Flathead Lake, when Jonah had been 12 and the sun had made bright coins on the water. On his last night, they ate stew and pretended not to count the hours. After dishes, David walked the yard with a flashlight, inspecting the fence as though fortifying the perimeter could protect the inside. I'll send money Friday, he said, and I'll call every town I pass with a decent signal. You don't owe me a map, Mabel said. Just keep your hands on the wheel. He tried to laugh, tried to say something about how hands on the wheel were his one marketable skill. The laugh broke. He reached for her, and she stepped into his arms. Jonah came out last and wrapped them both up, taller now than the summer at the lake, his chin against David's shoulder. In the morning, the pickup started with a tired cough and held on. David waved in 2 short arcs, one for each of them, and turned onto Cedar Lane. The taillights dwindled down the straight road until the red became a thought, and then the thought became a line Mabel could not cross. Inside, the house settled into a new quiet. The refrigerator kicked on. The clock over the stove resumed its rotary argument with time. Mabel made the beds, wrote a grocery list, folded the dish towels. She stood at the sink a long time, staring at the pines, until the phone on the wall rang. It was Pastor Mark. His voice had its practiced warmth. The church was organizing a meal train while you adjust, he said, as if David had gone on a trip and not been driven out by 100 small hands. We want to help. Mabel thanked him. She did not ask why help required a confession to start. When she hung up, she placed her palm flat on the cool countertop and breathed through a wave of anger that surprised her by its steadiness. Spring came late that year, reluctant and pale. The pines darkened with fresh growth. On good days, Jonah's laughter returned in sudden flashes that startled Mabel into smiling. On bad days, he moved like a boy carrying groceries that were too heavy but didn't want to spill. In town, people had begun to speak of the fire, less but of the Harrises no better. Silence is just another name for distance. Still, Mabel kept baking. She kept the porch swept. She kept, fiercely, the ordinary, because ordinary, she'd learned, was the first thing a rumor tries to steal. And on a morning when the sky looked freshly washed and the mail carrier's truck rattled like a toy, a thought arrived and sat down inside her. They could survive this. Survival wasn't triumph. It wasn't vindication. It was a stubbornness that tasted like bread you baked yourself because no one would bring you any. She dried her hands, picked up her coat, and headed toward town. She needed sugar. She needed envelopes. She needed to look people in the face and be seen. At Latham's, the bell rang the same as always. The aisle spread quiet before her. She took a basket and began again. And that was how the long winter in Cold Creek hardened into something else, something like resolve. By early June, the air in Cold Creek had grown heavy with the smell of grass and diesel. Thunderheads piled high over the Bitterroot Mountains, the kind that promised rain but often broke into nothing more than a spit of wind. The Whitaker fields were thick and green again, the new barn standing proud on the rise as if the fire had never happened. But the Harrises knew the fire was still there, burning, just out of sight. It started small, as these things often do. On a sticky Thursday evening, Jonah's summer league basketball team was playing a rival from over the county line. The gym smelled like popcorn and sweat, and the wooden floor gleamed under the bright lights. Mabel sat halfway up the bleachers, fanning herself with the program, watching Jonah move across the court with that quiet focus that made her proud. The score was tied with 2 minutes left, when Jonah took a pass at the top of the key and sank a clean three-pointer. The crowd made a collective noise, half cheer, half groan depending on which side they were on. Jonah didn't celebrate, just jogged back on defense. Then it happened. A boy from the opposing team called out loud enough for the gym to hear, "Better watch the ball. Harris, don't burn it down like your dad did." Laughter bubbled from the opposing bench. Even some from Cold Creek side let out a sharp bark of amusement before catching themselves. Jonah's head jerked toward the sound, but he didn't respond. He finished the game, made another basket, and kept his face as still as stone. Mabel, on the other hand, felt her nails dig crescents into her palm. She gripped the program so tightly it tore down the middle. After the buzzer, Jonah walked off without a word, the gym noise swelling around him like water he couldn't hear through. 2 days later, A different line was crossed. David had come back for a short stopover 3 days between trucking routes. His pickup was parked in the driveway when Mabel returned from town that afternoon with groceries. She noticed the mailbox was open, the letters scattered in the dust. Then she saw the red spray paint on their fence. It was just one word, in hurried block letters, arsonist. The paint dripped down the wood, bright against the weathered boards. Mabel's grocery bags thudded to the porch as David stepped out, his hands already curled into fists. "Who did this?" he demanded. "You think they signed it?" Mabel shot back, her voice sharp from shock. David's jaw worked. "Jonah, see it yet?" "No, and I'd rather," but it was too late. The front door opened, and Jonah stood there, his face pale, eyes fixed on the fence. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His shoulders said everything. How the word didn't surprise him. How he'd already been carrying it in other people's voices for years. David strode to the end of the lane, scanning the road. A few cars passed, drivers glancing over without. Slowing David, Mabel called, "Don't," but he was already walking fast toward the gas station at the corner. Mabel grabbed Jonah's arm and followed Dot at the station. A small group of men leaned against the ice chest, sipping sodas. One of them, Roy Denton, short, stocky, with a permanent squint, straightened when David approached. "You think you're clever." David's voice was low, but carried. Roy raised a brow. "If you're talking about your fence, I don't know what you mean. You've been running your mouth since the fire, Denton. If you've got something to say it to me, not my family. Maybe I don't like arsonists walking around like they belong here." That did it. David stepped forward, but Mabel's hand closed on his arm like a clamp. "Don't," she said again, this time in a voice that cut through the heat between them. Roy smirked. "See, even your wife knows you can't win this." Mabel turned her gaze on him, steady and cold. "No, Roy, I know exactly what it costs to fight people who've already decided what they want to believe." She pulled David back, and they walked away. But the tension clung to them all the way home. That night, the house was thick with unspoken words. Mabel made sandwiches. David didn't eat. Jonah sat at the table, his homework untouched. The spray paint still glared from the fence outside the window, impossible to ignore. Finally, David said, "I'm not coming back next month." Mabel looked up. "You mean?" "I mean I'll take the longer routes. South Dakota, Nebraska, maybe even down to Texas. I'll be gone more." "But," he exhaled, "it's easier than sitting here, waiting for the next thing they'll do." Jonah's pencil rolled off the table and clattered to the floor. He didn't pick it up. Mabel wanted to argue, to say running wouldn't change what people thought, but she could see the exhaustion in David's shoulders, the way his eyes avoided the window and the word painted there. She only said, "If you go, we'll manage." "I know you will," David said. "That's the problem. You always do." The next morning, David was out front with a bucket and scrub brush, scrubbing the fence until the wood was raw. Mabel brought him coffee, but neither of them spoke. Jonah left for basketball practice early, his duffel slung over one shoulder. When David finished, he stood back, breathing hard. The red was gone, but the boards were rougher, paler, as if the word had sunk into the grain and taken some of its strength with it. 3 days later, he left before dawn. No big wave this time, just a kiss on Mabel's temple, a squeeze of Jonah's shoulder, and the crunch of tires on gravel fading into the distance. In the weeks that followed, Mabel noticed the change in herself. She no longer flinched at the whispers, but she also no longer lingered in town. She kept errands brief, conversations shorter. Jonah came home later, his clothes smelling like the gym, but when she asked about practice, he only said, "It's fine," and disappeared upstairs. Summer settled in with long days and heavy air. On the 4th of July, the fireworks lit the sky over the fairgrounds, but Mabel and Jonah watched from their porch, the noise muffled by distance. She wondered, not for the first time, how many years it would take before this stopped feeling like exile. One muggy August afternoon, Mabel drove to the market for bread and found the main street buzzing with news. Thomas Whitaker, whose rebuilt barn had stood as a quiet rebuke to the Harrises for years, had collapsed at home. They said it was his heart. They said he didn't suffer. They said the funeral would be the biggest Cold Creek had seen in a decade. Mabel stood in the bread aisle, staring at the loaves without seeing them. Whitaker's death didn't erase anything. It didn't make the fence whole again, or give David back the years he'd spent under suspicion. But something about it felt unfinished. She bought her bread, paid the cashier, and walked out into the bright afternoon, the air heavy with the scent of cut hay and the sound of gossip spilling into the street. At home, she set the bread on the counter and stood by the window, looking at the pale boards of the fence. She didn't know it yet, but Whitaker's passing would set in motion the first crack in the wall Cold Creek had built around her family. The church bell began tolling at 10 that morning, slow, heavy strikes that rolled down Cedar Lane and into the hollows of Cold Creek. Each peal seemed to pull the town toward the white steepled church at the center of Main Street. From her kitchen window, Mabel watched the cars pass. They moved in a slow procession, polished sedans, dusty farm trucks, even the mayor's old Lincoln gliding by like it was leading a parade. People inside wore their Sunday best, shoulders squared, faces set. In that peculiar mix of grief and obligation, small towns carry two funerals. She hadn't planned on going. That decision had been made the moment she heard the news. She would stay home, avoid the eyes that might still hold old judgments even in the shadow of death. But as she stood there, dish towel in hand, watching neighbors she hadn't spoken to in years pass her gate, something shifted. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. And it wasn't curiosity. It was more like a stubbornness, a refusal to let the town story of her family be written without her present to hear it. By the time the last of the cars had passed, Mabel was upstairs, pulling on her black wool coat. She pinned her hair back, took one last look in the mirror, and stepped outside into the clear, cool air. The church was already full when she arrived. People stood in small clusters under the eaves, their breath clouding in the crisp air. Conversations fell to a murmur when she walked up the steps, and a narrow aisle seemed to part for her. Not out of welcome, but out of avoidance. Inside, the scent of polished wood and lilies clung to the warm air. A large photograph of Thomas Whitaker, smiling in a way Mabel had rarely seen in life, stood beside the closed casket. He wore his best suit in the picture, tie neatly knotted, eyes bright with something that almost passed for kindness. Mabel slipped into a pew near the back. From there, she could see the entire room, the Whitaker family seated in the front, Pastor Mark adjusting his notes at the pulpit, and the steady stream of townsfolk pressing forward to offer condolences. She found herself studying the faces, noticing the small cracks in their composure. Judy Park dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The Lathams stood stiffly, their lips pressed thin. Even Roy Denton, the man who had smirked at her husband weeks before, sat with his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles whitened. Guilt, Mabel thought, had its own body language. Halfway through the service, Pastor Mark spoke of Thomas Whitaker's contributions to Cold Creek, how he'd served on the town council, donated to the church roof fund, and kept the grain flowing every harvest season. He did not speak of the fire. He did not speak of David Harris. Mabel listened anyway, hearing the silences as much as the words. When the final hymn ended and people began to rise, she stayed seated, letting the crowd funnel out ahead of her. That was when she noticed Caleb, the young postmaster, slipping quietly into the side aisle. He was carrying a small cardboard box, the kind the post office used to store undelivered or misaddressed mail. He nodded politely to Mabel on his way past, then disappeared through the narrow door that led to the basement archives. Down in the post office basement, Caleb set the box on a work table under the dim yellow glow of a single bulb. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by his steps. He'd been slowly working through a backlog of old mail, left in storage, misdelivered letters, unclaimed packages, and the occasional postcard sent to someone long since gone. Halfway through the stack, he saw it, a yellow envelope, the paper softened with age, the edges worn. The handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, careful, and old-fashioned. He'd seen it on grain invoices and council meeting minutes. The return address was the Whitaker farm. Across the front, in bold letters, was written, "To the people of Cold Creek, read only after I'm gone." Caleb stared at it for a long moment, his pulse picking up. He checked the date. In the corner it had been mailed just weeks before Thomas Whitaker's death, but for some reason, it had never been processed. He turned it over in his hands, wondering, in a place like Cold Creek, an envelope like this could be dynamite. Upstairs, Mabel lingered in the church foyer as the crowd thinned. She caught snippets of conversation. Heart just gave out. Didn't suffer, they said. Whole town owes him a debt. She wondered what the debt truly was, and to whom it was owed. As she stepped outside, she spotted Caleb locking up the post office across the street, the box of old mail tucked under his arm. For the briefest moment, their eyes met, and she thought she saw something like hesitation there, as if he carried more than just letters. Back home, Mabel hung her coat by the door and made tea. Jonah was out at practice, the house quiet except for the occasional creak of the settling walls. She sipped slowly, replaying the day. The way people had looked at her, not hostile, but measuring, the way they'd avoided saying her name. And that moment with Caleb, brief, but enough to make her wonder. In a small town, secrets didn't stay buried forever, but sometimes they took their time climbing to the surface. The next morning, the sky was the pale washed blue of late summer. Mabel went about her chores, laundry, sweeping the porch, weeding the small patch of garden where stubborn marigolds still bloomed. She was bent over the flower bed when she heard footsteps on the gravel. Caleb stood at the gate, the yellow envelope in his hand. "Mrs. Harris," he said, voice careful. "I found something yesterday. I think you might want to be there when the town sees it." Her eyes dropped to the handwriting on the envelope. Even before she read the name, she knew. Thomas Whitaker. The rain came early that morning, a steady, cold drizzle that darkened the sidewalks and turned the gravel outside the post office into a patchwork of puddles. By the time Mabel reached the corner, her coat was damp at the shoulders, and the hem clung to her calves. Inside, the small building was packed. The air smelled of wet wool and coffee from paper cups people had brought with them. Boots scuffed against the floor, the low hum of murmured conversation rising and falling like a tide. Every P.O. box door glinted in the dim light, little brass squares watching the scene unfold. Caleb stood behind the counter, the yellow envelope lying in front of him like an artifact. His expression was unreadable, focused, maybe, but with a weight in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Beside him, a small stack of folded papers waited like they were holding their own breath. Mabel slid into a spot near the back. She could see nearly every face in the room. Judy Park, holding her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles showed white. Roy Denton, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. The Lathams, whispering into each other's ears. The sound of the rain outside only made the room feel more closed in. Caleb cleared his throat, the noise cutting through the murmur. I found this yesterday while sorting undelivered mail from the basement. It's addressed to the people of Cold Creek, and it's dated 3 weeks before Thomas Whitaker passed away. He let that settle before adding, the envelope says it's to be read only after he's gone. I believe that means today. A shift in the room, shoulders straightening, people leaning forward just slightly. Caleb took the envelope in both hands. He didn't hurry. He slid a letter opener along the edge with the care of someone handling something fragile, then pulled out 3 folded pages. The paper was worn but uncreased, the handwriting slanted and deliberate. He began to read. My name is Thomas Whitaker. If you are hearing these words, it means I have gone to meet my maker, and before I face him, I need to face you. 5 years ago, the barn fire changed this town. Most of you know the story you've been telling yourselves since then, that David Harris had a grudge against me, that he was careless, maybe even malicious. You let that story grow until it rooted deep. I let it grow too. The truth is this, I caused the fire. I had been drinking that night and I left the lantern burning in the loft. When the barn went up, I knew it was my fault. But when whispers started about David, I kept quiet. I feared what the truth would cost me money, respect, friends. I chose my comfort over another man's name, and I watched as his family paid the price for my cowardice. I can't undo what I've done, but I can confess it here, to all of you. If you believe in the God we claim to worship every Sunday, then you know that silence in the face of a lie is its own sin. I ask you to give the Harris family back the respect you took from them. I ask for your forgiveness, though I know I may not deserve it. Signed, Thomas Whitaker. The room was silent when Caleb's voice fell away. Even the rain outside seemed to have slowed. Mabel stood very still. The words landed one by one, heavy as stones. Pressing down on years of memory, David scrubbing the red spray paint off the fence. Jonah walking home alone from the gym, the empty seats at Christmas dinner. From the front, Judy Park let out a soft sob. Somewhere near the wall, Roy Denton's arms dropped from their crossed position, his gaze fixed on the floor. The Lathams exchanged a look, hesitation, guilt, maybe both. God help us. Someone whispered. Caleb folded the letter and placed it on the counter. That's all there is. For a moment, no one moved. Then an older man, Mr. Harlan, who'd once been David's closest friend, stepped forward. His voice shook. We let this go on too long. Too damn long. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, though some faces remained closed, their eyes calculating. As people began to leave, the atmosphere shifted thick with something between shame and relief. A few approached Mabel, offering awkward apologies. Judy Park squeezed her hand and said, I'm so sorry. I should have said something years ago. Mabel accepted the words without committing to forgiveness. She wasn't ready to give away that part of herself yet. Roy Denton lingered by the door, looking like a man who'd been caught in a lie but couldn't yet admit it. Their eyes met for a moment before he turned and walked out into the rain. Outside, the drizzle had turned to a fine mist. Mabel stepped into it, letting the cool dampness settle on her skin. She didn't rush home. Each step felt strange, as if she were walking in a town that had been rearranged overnight. Same streets, same buildings, but something in the air had shifted. At the corner, she passed 2 women talking under an umbrella. They glanced at her, then didn't look away. One of them even gave a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was different. When she reached her gate, she paused, looking at the fence. The boards were still pale and rough, where David had scrubbed away the word. But now, when she looked at them, she saw something else, not just the damage, but the space where something new could grow. That night, Jonah sat at the kitchen table, homework spread before him. I heard about the letter, he said without looking up. Everyone has, Mabel replied. They believed it. He asked. Most of them, I think. Jonah nodded slowly. Good. Then, after a pause, but it doesn't give us back the 5 years. No, Mabel said. It doesn't. She placed a hand on his shoulder. But maybe it gives us the rest of them. Later, lying in bed, Mabel thought of David. She pictured him somewhere on a dark stretch of highway, rain streaking across the windshield, his hand steady on the wheel. She wondered how she would tell him and what his voice would sound like when he heard the words. The morning after the letter was read, the clouds broke open, and sunlight poured over Cold Creek like a clean sheet pulled across a rumpled bed. The streets shone with the last traces of rain, and the mountains in the distance looked sharp and close enough to touch. Mabel stepped onto the porch with her coffee, and for the first time in years, a neighbor waved first. It was Mrs. Latham, walking toward the market with an empty basket on her arm. The gesture was small, tentative, but it landed somewhere deep. By mid-morning, the first gifts began to arrive. A jar of peach preserves, still warm from sealing, left on the porch railing. A basket of fresh eggs with a note that read simply, "For your table." Someone even hung a bundle of lavender from the fence post, the scent carrying in the breeze. Mabel accepted them with quiet gratitude, but she knew these were offerings of conscience, not friendship. Apologies wrapped in brown paper. Jonah came home from school that afternoon with a folded letter in his pocket. It was an invitation to rejoin the varsity basketball team for the upcoming season. They said I should think about it. He told her over dinner, pushing potatoes around his plate. And do you want to? He hesitated. Part of me does, but he shrugged. Part of me doesn't want to give them the satisfaction of thinking everything's fine now. Mabel understood. You don't owe them that, she said. Whatever you choose, make sure it's for you, not for them. He nodded, but his expression stayed guarded. The town had given him an open door, but trust wasn't something you could hand back like a library book. The next day, the phone rang while Mabel was in the kitchen, kneading bread. She wiped her hands on a towel and picked up the receiver. Mabel. It was David. His voice was steady, but there was something in it, an edge she couldn't name. I heard, he said, about Whitaker's letter. They read it yesterday. Everyone was there. Did they believe it? Yes. A pause. Good, he said. Another pause. But it's been 5 years. Mabel, that doesn't just go away. I know. She leaned against the counter, twisting the phone cord around her fingers. You should come home. I will. Not yet, but I will. I need to be ready to see it all again. She didn't press him. We'll be here. Over the next week, Mabel noticed changes in the way people looked at her. The cashier at Latham's grocery asked about her garden. Pastor Mark stopped her on the sidewalk to say he'd like to have her pies at the church bake sale again. Yet, for every smile, there were glances that slid away too quickly, conversations that dropped into silence as she approached. Cold Creek had accepted the truth, but it hadn't yet decided what to do with it. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Mabel took a walk along Cedar Lane. The air was heavy with the scent of lilac, and the sound of sprinklers ticked in distant yards. She paused at the fence where David had scrubbed away the red spray paint months ago. The boards were still pale and rough, but in the cracks between them, tiny green shoots had begun to grow, wildflowers carried by the wind. She thought about how, after a fire, some seeds needed heat to break open and grow. Maybe people were the same. Maybe what had been burned couldn't be restored, but something different could grow in its place. By the second week, the gifts on the porch slowed. The baskets of eggs and jars of preserves gave way to nods in the street. The occasional wave. The town's rhythm was shifting back toward ordinary life. Jonah decided to return to the basketball team, though he told Mabel he wouldn't go to the first practice until he'd spoken to the coach privately. They need to hear from me what I expect, he said. She admired that the quiet strength in him, so much like his father's before the silence had worn him down. One evening, after practice, Jonah came home with a light in his eyes she hadn't seen in years. We ran drills. No one said a word about the fire. He paused. It felt normal. Normal was a word she didn't trust, but she let herself smile anyway. A week later, she received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was David's. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with just one line written in his neat, deliberate script. Tell Jonah I'm proud of him. Tell yourself the same thing. She read it twice before setting it in the box with Whitaker. Confession. 2 letters, side by side, one a wound, the other a salve. On a clear Saturday morning, Mabel took out a trowel and a packet of seeds she'd been saving for years, lupins, the kind that grew tall and purple-blue against the mountain backdrop. She knelt by the fence and pressed the seeds into the earth along the paleboards. Jonah came out and crouched beside her. What are you planting? Something that will take its time, she said, but when it blooms, you'll see it from the road. He handed her the next seed. Together, they worked their way along the fence line. That night, as darkness fell, Mabel switched on the porch light and left it burning. She had done it without thinking, but when she stepped back into the kitchen and saw its warm glow through the window, she realized it felt like an invitation, one. She wasn't sure to whom. Maybe to David, somewhere out on the road. Maybe to anyone in Cold Creek willing to cross the distance. The truth had changed things. It had cleared her husband's name, given her son a measure of justice. But it couldn't give them back the birthdays spent apart, the winters they'd eaten Christmas dinner in silence, the years of walking into rooms where conversations stopped. Some things weren't meant to be fixed. They were meant to be carried. Mabel stood at the window, watching the porch light pool over the steps, and decided that carrying wasn't the same as surrendering. It was simply the way forward, and as long as that light was on, the door would never be entirely closed.